you seem like you're in love with him, but you love Ryle. And I was like, no, I also love Ryle, but like, I really love Atlas. He's like, you love Ryle. And I was like, wait, I'm sorry. Wait, what's happening? But you love Ryle. I do, but like, she's conflicted. Totally. And that was always an interesting dynamic when you have somebody who's playing the character also being the one like looking at the movie. So we were always like, are we too connected? Are we too vibing?
Yeah.
But she loves Ryle. He's the best. I mean, she loves Atlas. She also loves Ryle. She loves Atlas and young Atlas and young.
Hey besties, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. Finally, some good news to start the day. After what felt like an endless streak of Blake Lively skating by every single time, people genuinely started to believe she was untouchable. That Judge Lyman was practically in her back pocket. But guess what? That illusion might finally be cracking. For once, it looks like accountability is on the horizon, and not even Blake's carefully curated charm or Ryan's smug grin can smooth this one over. I mean, come on. Let's be real. We still think Judge Lyman's a little bit in her pocket, right? Like, no one's buying that everything's suddenly fair and balanced here. But still, this is progress. Jed Wallace has officially been dismissed from Blake Lively's lawsuit in New York. And not because of some shady backroom deal or Hollywood favor, but on actual legal grounds. The state of New York and Judge Lyman, over in federal district court, both agreed that his involvement didn't hold up under scrutiny. New York lacks jurisdiction over Jed Wallace since he's actually a resident of Texas. And what's really interesting here is that, in this ruling, Judge Lyman didn't just dismiss him and move on. He commented on a few of Blake's claims. He actually teased through some of the so-called incidents that Blake says happened in New York, and let's just say, it doesn't make her look great. The language in the ruling hints that even the court isn't fully convinced her version of events lines up with the facts. It kind of weakens her case against some of the other people involved too. So, even though Blake might have thought this was just a small procedural setback, it's actually a big red flag. If the court is already questioning jurisdiction and credibility when it comes to Jed Wallace, it means they might start looking closer at the foundation of her entire lawsuit. The timelines, the evidence, and the people she's accusing. And when that happens, things can start to crumble fast. And he said something that really stood out, that it's unusual for defendants, who are clearly based in California, to let a case like this drag on in New York when jurisdiction is such an obvious issue. It almost felt like he was hinting, why are they still here? As if even the judge could see that this entire case might have been filed in the wrong place to begin with. And if that's true, then Blake's team might have just wasted months, maybe years, fighting in a court that never even had the proper authority to hear it. Personal jurisdiction, because Blake failed to demonstrate any actual connection between Jed Wallace's alleged actions and the state of New York. In simple terms, nothing he did happened there, nothing he said was published or circulated from there, and she couldn't prove any measurable damage in New York. It's a huge blow to her case, because the judge basically said, you can't just pick New York because it sounds powerful. You have to prove that something actually happened here. And with prejudice. So let me quickly explain. When a case is dismissed without prejudice, it means Blake can technically refile the claim again, but only if she brings it in the correct jurisdiction. In this case, likely California or Texas. If it had been dismissed with prejudice, it would mean the claim is permanently dead. So while this isn't a total loss for Blake, it's still embarrassing because it shows her legal team didn't even get the basics right. Exactly. And that's what's happening here. The judge isn't saying Blake's claims have merit, just that she filed them in the wrong place. It's like a procedural try again, not a win. So while her supporters might spin this as the case isn't over, the reality is it's a setback that exposes sloppy legal strategy. It also subtly undercuts her credibility, because if her team can't even determine the proper jurisdiction, it makes the rest of her sprawling accusations look just as careless. California, the litigation privilege applies to anything that was said or done in the course of defending himself, meaning Jed Wallace can't be sued for statements made during legal proceedings. That's why Judge Lyman dismissed that part with prejudice. It's final. Blake can't refile those same claims anywhere else. So, while technically she could take the jurisdictional issue to Texas, the substance of her claim against Jed is already dead in the water. Essentially, half her argument is blocked forever, and the rest would be an uphill climb in another state, in engagement, sales, and reputation right after those dates. But Judge Lyman points out something really crucial here. None of that negative press originated from Jed Wallace, nor did any of it have a traceable link to activity inside New York. In other words, even if Blake wants to believe that Wallace somehow masterminded an online smear campaign, she hasn't actually presented any factual evidence tying those online attacks to him or to his company operating in New York. The judge practically spells it out, that what she's describing sounds like organic media fallout, not a coordinated defamation plot. And since the alleged damage, like her business losses, was reputational and public image related, not localized to any single state, he doesn't buy that New York has any business overseeing this case. It's a subtle but devastating point, because it hints that her entire argument about being targeted could fall apart if it's ever put under real scrutiny, used to shape media narratives. But he said that in this case, none of that was done. No bots, no fake accounts, no paid smear work, nothing of the kind. His declaration basically paints a picture of a consultant doing light media analysis for a few months, not an orchestrator of a digital war. And the judge seemed to agree. Judge Lyman explicitly wrote that there's no factual basis connecting Wallace's activity in Texas to any alleged defamation or reputational harm within New York. The supposed digital army Blake keeps referencing doesn't exist, at least not in any legal or evidentiary sense. What she's describing, the judge noted, sounds more like public sentiment reacting to her own behavior during the It Ends With Us rollout rather than a targeted campaign. It's one of the sharpest blows yet to her broader narrative. Because if Jed Wallace, the alleged data mastermind, is out, that means one of her cornerstone claims of a coordinated takedown just evaporated. And without that, she's left trying to convince the court and the public that all of her backlash was artificially engineered, when in reality, the evidence shows it was largely self-inflicted. Jed Wallace didn't provide any services related to It Ends With Us. Wayfair, Beldoni, Blake Lively, or Ryan Reynolds. He didn't publish anything about them, didn't direct anyone else to post about them, and didn't provide information to journalists or media outlets like the New York Post or New York Times. There's no digital army, no team in Hawaii, no coordinated campaign. His role was purely passive, observing and analyzing the social media landscape. He also notes that he's been to New York only 4 times since 1991, and all work related to Beldoni and Wayfair was done in Texas, primarily for clients in California. The court looked at the procedural history and specifically required supplemental briefing on Wallace's assertion that Lively failed to identify any specific co-conspirator committing a tangible act in New York that could be tied to him. The legal standard here is clear. Personal jurisdiction must show a connection between each defendant and the place where the lawsuit is filed. This ensures no one is forced to defend themselves in a distant forum with no real link to the case. Judge Lyman agreed that the Wallace defendants are based in Texas and that Lively hasn't alleged any acts by them that would tie them to New York. Most of the alleged negative publicity happened outside New York, and the few actions targeting New York were carried out by other parties, not Wallace. Therefore, he cannot be forced to defend this lawsuit in New York. If Blake wants to pursue her claims against him, she'll have to do it in another state, or she could try to amend her complaint to establish jurisdiction. It's unusual that the judge is allowing her to replead at all, given how thin her connections to New York are, but that's the procedural path she could take. Judge Lyman also addressed Blake's claim that she could provide evidence tying Jed Wallace to New York. He was skeptical, noting that if such evidence actually existed, she likely would have submitted it with her complaint or during discovery, which is nearly complete. Since she hasn't, the court doubts it even exists. Blake reportedly argued that Wallace's declaration shouldn't be considered, but the judge clarified that courts can consider affidavits and other materials beyond the pleadings when evaluating a motion to dismiss. While the court cannot simply credit Wallace's declaration over her allegations without a hearing or jurisdictional discovery, in this case, no such procedures were needed. Even assuming the truth of her complaint's allegations, they still don't. Established jurisdiction over Wallace, Judge Lyman then went into New York state law on jurisdiction. To establish specific jurisdiction, a defendant must transact business within the state, or contract to supply goods or services there, commit a tortious act within the state, except in certain defamation claims, commit a tortious act outside the state that causes injury within the state, or regularly solicit business or engage in a persistent course of conduct in the state, generating substantial revenue and reasonably expecting consequences there. The court noted that Blake made no argument, and couldn't, that Wallace himself had any contacts that satisfy these standards. Wallace lives in Texas, his companies are incorporated in California, and his principal place of business is in Texas. There are no allegations that he transacted business in New York or committed tortious acts there. The amended complaint also fails to allege that any acts by Wallace caused injury in New York or that his business activities had a general presence there. Blake tried to argue jurisdiction based on, a conspiracy theory, but the judge found that irrelevant. Looking at the complaint itself, it becomes clear why it was filed in New York. The only evidence she obtained related to Wallace came through a New York subpoena, which she acquired during the sham Banzam action against Jen Abel. California subpoenas, by contrast, have stricter rules about notifying targets. So filing in New York was more convenient, but it doesn't create proper jurisdiction. Here's why Blake filed in New York. Under California law, if you're subpoenaed for records, even indirectly, the entity holding the information, like an employer or Google, has to notify you because it's your private information. But Blake didn't follow that process. Through her Vanzon action, she obtained Jen Abel's records without notifying her, using a sham action that involved a shell company. Because of that, she can't just refile this lawsuit in California. If she tried, she'd have to domesticate the subpoena there, which would automatically notify Jen Abel. Jen could then object or try to quash the subpoena on privacy grounds. And we've already seen this court doesn't hesitate to quash improper subpoenas. The judge pointed out that if Blake had gone through the proper legal channels to get Jen's phone records, she would not have succeeded. This loophole explains why New York became the filing venue, but it doesn't magically create jurisdiction over Wallace. It's a procedural convenience, not a legal connection. The Wallace defendants were particularly persuasive when it came to Blake's conspiracy jurisdiction theory. The idea that she could drag Wallace into New York courts simply because he allegedly influenced others who are in New York. Their argument? This approach doesn't align with more recent New York case law, which requires that an out-of-state defendant exert some level of control over the in-state actor in order for jurisdiction to be imputed. Conspiracy jurisdiction in New York comes from the Court of Appeals. Decision in Crater via McFadden Oil Company. The ruling clarified that acting through an agent doesn't require a formal agency relationship. Instead, it can be satisfied if the agent engages in purposeful activities within the state for the benefit of, and with the knowledge and consent of, the non-domiciliary defendant, essentially showing that the defendant exercised some control. But here's the kicker. If conspiracy isn't invoked, case law is clear that some control is always necessary to satisfy the agency language. And in Wallace's case, the court found that Blake simply didn't show that level of control, meaning her entire attempt to shoehorn him into New York jurisdiction falls. Apart. Judge Lyman noted that the New York Court of Appeals hasn't directly ruled on this issue, but the Second Circuit has